Pop-Kultur. Commissioned Work. King Khan.
In unregelmäßigen weißen Buchstaben auf rotem fleckigem Hintergrund. Rat-Tribution now. Ein Bindestrich trennt die erste Silbe des Titels vom Rest des Wortes. In weiß auf schwarz. Dedicated to the missing and murdered indigenous women and girls. Ein gezeichneter Clip. Die Umrisse Indiens.
In the Kobol village, found in the Darbhanga district of the Indian province of Bihar, the Musahar were a caste of people named for catching and eating rats. They were even poorer than the untouchables.
Ein Feld.
They survived by sharpening one end of a wooden stick and poking small holes inside a farmer's field, where the rats would intuitively collect grain for them. Occasionally one would fall into the hole and get stuck and die. When the Musafars would come to collect their grains from the small holes, they would find the dead rats and eat them too.
Eine Familie.
They've lived in this area for over 150 years. This is their story.
Das Gesicht eines Mädchens.
Savitri was the darkest and youngest of her 4 sisters. Her name was a very common one given to many baby girls.
Mit Nasenpiercing.
In Hindi it meant a ray of light or hymn, and was related to Devi, the Hindu goddess, the embodiment of female energy.
Die Zeichnung gewinnt an Detail.
Of Shiva the Destroyer, one of the 3 chief divinities of Hinduism. She had grown up swinging from trees and chasing her siblings throughout the wild, and was told to never do 2 things: wander into the village or play near the train tracks.
Eine schmächtige Frau.
Her mother's name, Fulan, meant blossoming flower, and she passed on her love of flowers to Savitri, who would sit in front of the cocknar flowers, often when she was just an infant, and stare into them, imagining herself in miniature, hopping from petal to petal.
Savitri mit einer Blüte.
When she had turned 8 years old, her mother wanted to show her how to fetch food. She thought she was old enough to learn.
Das Feld.
Pulan took Savitri by hand and waited till the sun went down and darkness filled the air. They would rustle through the wild until they stopped in front of Thakur Sahib's field. Fulan blocked Savitri's mouth so she would remain silent.
Der Himmel ist rot.
They carefully surveyed the area to make sure the farmers had all left. Fulan took the hand of her half-naked daughter and walked into the fields with her back bent, examining the ground. Savitri's eyes adjusted quickly to the moonlight, and suddenly, what it revealed to her was little silos of food gathered by her rat foot soldiers. She smiled, and her eyes grew wide as she saw her mother thrust her hand into the bounty of grains and pull out a dead rat.
Sie hält sie am Schwanz.
Tomorrow night would be the first night she'd be allowed to go and collect on her own.
Die Zeichnung verblasst.
The small village that Savitri lived in had no running water or electricity.
5 Geschwister
In fact,
an einer Lehmhütte.
she did not even know of the existence of these 2 modern inventions. Her village was located many miles from the train tracks, and she had been warned about the huge metal monster that rode those tracks and that loved severing the arms and legs of Musahar children. She had never seen a train or had the desire to. Musahar families were never allowed to attend school. They were on the lowest rung of the caste system and lived an invisible life. They feared the civilized world and preferred to hunt at night, never to be seen. Guided by the light of the moon, their skin as dark as the night sky. Their eyes powerful enough to see their bounty stuffed inside the earth by rats. As the sun went down, Pulan had prepared a meal of snails and small fish she had found in the wetlands. She wanted Savitri to eat up and have some strength for her first outing to collect the dead rats and their offerings of grains. Savitri finished her meal quickly and waited for the full moon to guide her. Her mother kissed her on her head
Der Kuss.
and whispered a prayer into her ears to bless her on her first journey. She blew the prayers into her ear and asked the deities to protect her daughter and return her home safely. Meanwhile, Thakur Sahib summoned his servants. He was excited to have a few of his best friends coming to see him on this full moon night, and he asked that they prepare a place in the fields to receive them. His servants pitched a small tent in the fields and loaded it with libations, mainly Sora, a strong beer made of fermented grains.
Ein buntes Rundzelt bei Vollmond.
As Thakur Sahib's guests arrived, he greeted them with much excitement.
Der Himmel ist mit Sternen übersät.
And they all proceeded to the tent in the fields. The fevered festivities commenced. Savitri approached Thakur Sahib's field with a wild excitement. This voyage would be her initiation, her rite of passage, and she felt her mother's gaze flying over her with pride and avarice, waiting for her to bring some food to feed the entire family.
Ein Blick ins Zelt.
As Savitri approached the field, she saw a beautiful multicolored tent in the distance. It looked like a giant flower, one that she had never seen before. Her curiosity swelled, and she wanted to take a closer look at what was inside. She could hear loud laughter as she snuck closer to it. She wondered why these village folk were in the field so late at night, and why they were laughing so loud. When she came close enough to the tent, she looked in.
Männer mit Lendenschurz. Sogenannten Lungis.
She noticed Thakur Sahib right away, for he was the fattest of them all. He sat shirtless, with only a lungi, and guzzled his drink, swaying back and forth in throes of passion and excitement. Savitri was surprised at the sight of these men. She had never seen a group of people acting so strange. She wondered if it was what they were drinking in copious amounts
Zeichnung gewinnt an Detail.
that was making them act crazier and crazier, laughing and screaming without any regard for the rest of the jungle. She remembered seeing a parrot once, falling off of trees in dizzy spells, acting the same way. Her mother had told her that the parrots were drunken from a strange, foul-smelling, rotten red nectar. When Savitri decided she had had enough of these foolish, parrot-like drunkards, she got up to go back to the fields for her first harvest. She stood up and suddenly felt a man's hand wrap around her arm violently. "Thakur Sahib, look what I have found! A bloody musahar! Shall we eat her or feed her to the rats?" asked his servant, as he cackled with an eruption of intoxicated evil laughter. Savitri tried to fight back with all her might, but was no match for this man. Her 8-year-old body shuffled back and forth, but the man had his hands locked around both arms. Now she couldn't escape.
Ein Schnurrbärtiger.
Thakur Sahib gazed at Savitri
Mit Turban.
with a look that she had never seen, and it terrified her. His eyes examined her from head to toe. He smiled a sinister smile and licked his inebriated lips. "Bring her to me, but take off all her rags." The servant struggled a bit until another one came to help him.
4 Hände.
They held her arms and legs as she tried with all her might to wriggle free.
Halten sie am Boden.
They spoke slurred in a language she found difficult to understand. As she feared for her very life, a third servant approached with a huge sword and tore her rags off. She was naked and her body pinned down by 2 men. She screamed in hopes that someone in the jungle would hear her
Der
cries,
Schnurrbärtige verengt die Augen.
but no one came.
Das Bild ist schwarz.
Thakur Sahib, his guests and servants took their turns violating the poor Savitri. She had lost her voice from shouting as loud as she could. When they had finished with her, they threw her into the fields and went back to festivities. Give her back to the rats, Thakur Sahib commanded.
Der Mond.
Savitri sank into the fields, her eyes filled with tears and blood, burning with rage. She felt the power of all the young rat eaters who had been raped and killed before her, and she pulled her ravaged body up and looked to the moon. Beneath her feet, she saw the little holes filled with grain. She reached her hand inside and pulled out a suffocating rat,
Savitris Gesicht
clinging to its dear life.
scheint durch den Mond.
She stared into its eyes and bit its head off and spat it out, revolted by the fresh taste, relieving it of its suffering. She stared at its body as it twitched in her hands and began eating it, her mouth full of blood and meat. She felt her reckoning was about to begin.
Blutspritze auf dem Gesicht.
Slowly, but surely, Thakur Sahib and his servants were getting so drunk that they began passing out and falling asleep. Savitri waited outside of the tent. She snuck up close enough to peer into the gate and saw her violators one by one fall into a slumber. She quickly noticed the blade that they had used to remove her clothing. It was cast aside on the floor next to the opening of the tent, within her grasp. As the last of the servants passed out, she snuck into the tent and grabbed the blade. With all her might, she sprung silently into the air and began slicing each of their throats. The sound of choking and gargling filled the air as their blood flowed like a mighty river. She approached Thakur Sahib, and their eyes met as she grabbed his head and severed his jugular. She smiled as his body was drained of life. She grabbed Sahib's lifeless body and began dismembering it. It took all of her strength as she cracked ligaments and tendons and hacked away with the sword. She collected all the dismembered arms in a pile. Now it was time for the heads. The fire from the torches had gone out. All that was left was the unforgiving moon, shining down on her black, sinewy body.
Sie kauert am Boden.
She was covered in blood.
Blutrote Ströme umschließen ovalförmig die Silhouette. 4 rote Stränge fließen von den Seiten zur Mitte. Ein riesiges grüngelbes Auge blinzelt. Die Ströme werden lila-gelb. Ein Schlund mit Reißzähnen. Savitris Haare stehen zu Berge. Sie nimmt eine bedrohliche Pose ein. Ein grüngelbes Wesen mit pulsierenden Augäpfeln. Aus dunkelgrünen Strömen schießt ein Blitz. Sie hebt das Schwert. Sie schreit. Tentakel am Wesen. Baumelnde Arme. Savitri kauert am Boden. Die Ströme werden dunkler. Schreiend schwingt Savitri das blutige Schwert. Inmitten rot-violetter Ströme wirbelt Savitri mit dem Schwert abgetrennten Gliedmaßen und Köpfen umher. Ihr Gesicht in schwarz-weiß überlagert das Bild.
She tore a piece of cloth from the tent and decided it was time to adorn herself with her bounty. She tied each of the severed arms onto the torn cloth and wove a garment for her to tie around her waist.
Sie streckt die Arme hoch.
She spun in circles and felt the warm air swirl around her newly made dress. She collected the heads and tied their hairs together and threw them around her neck. It was the first necklace she had ever made. The sun began to rise. As Savitri walked out of the tent, she looked onto the fields and began walking in the opposite direction. She knew not where she was going, but she wanted to be as far away as possible. She feared what her mother would say and the beating that might follow. She walked with the limbs dangling around her skinny legs, their lifeless fingers caressing every little hole in the ground. She reached the train tracks and heard the train whistle loudly in her ears. She stood there stunned by the loud shriek of the brakes as the train came to a halting stop. She had never seen the great metal monster before and stood in front of it, stunned. The conductor of the train could not believe his eyes. He took off his hat and quickly climbed down from the train. His eyes stared at Savitri in utter disbelief. The passengers sitting atop of the train's roof began leaping off to get a look for themselves. The other passengers opened their windows and popped their heads out in wonder. There she was,
vor dem Zug.
poor Savitri, the sun bearing down on her, with her necklace of human heads and a dress of severed arms around her waist. Suddenly a murmur was heard. The witnesses began saying her name, Savitri, under their breath. It was the only word that came to their lips. They thought they were staring at a goddess.
Orange-violette Formen umgeben Savitri.
They did not know that it was in fact her real name. Savitri felt 1,000 eyes cast upon her naked 8-year-old body and began to shake as she yelled from the top of her lungs, Nine Savitri! Behold John! I am Savitri, you sister fuckers!
Savitris Silhouette schwingt mit den Formen hin und her.
The witnesses' mouths widened in disbelief as Savitri ran back into the jungle, never to be heard or seen again.
Das Bild wird schwarz. In Weiß auf Schwarz, gezeichnet von Saba Eine dunkle Silhouette in einem kleinen weißen Oval. Erzählt von Joe Coleman nach der Kurzgeschichte Tale of the Rat Eaters von A.A. Khan.
When you put me down without a sound, how will the world ever know?
Regie King Khan und Saba Khan.
Seems like it's gone astray. Who'll be the keeper of my soul?
Montage Dominik Marder.
The keeper of my soul. Who'll be the keeper of my soul?
Inspiriert von der Kunst Joe Colemans und Molly Crabapple. Und von der Musik und dem Aktivismus von Buffy St. Mary und Tanya Tagaq. Im kleinen Oval steht die Silhouette einer Frau. Joe Colemans Portrait of King Khan, animiert von Dominik Marder. Music, Supervision und Sounddesign A.A. Khan. Die Frau im Oval ist schwanger. Ton Nene Baratto und Matt Clarke. Musik White Nile Flows Through Memphis, performt von King Khan, Martin Wenk und John Convertino. Rat-Eater Raga, performt von King Khan. Dead Moon Night, performt von Dead Moon. Die Silhouette im Oval verblasst. She's the Keeper of My Soul, performt von Saba Khan. Die Frau im Oval trägt ein Kind auf dem Arm. Erhältlich bei Carnivalism. Mit Dank an Pop-Kultur 2020 Berlin und Factor Canada.
My babies love.
Eine Kahn Family Production. Im Oval die Frau mit Stock und gebeugtem Rücken. Das Oval verblasst, das Bild wird schwarz.
Es folgt der Abspann. Popkultur. www.pop-kultur.berlin. Popkultur 2020. Eine Veranstaltung der Music Board Berlin GmbH. Gefördert von der Beauftragten der Bundesregierung für Kultur und Medien. Initiative Musik GmbH. Factor Canada. Die Regierung Kanadas.
Audiodeskription Jonas Hauer, Tanja Eichler-Ojake, Anne Leichtfuß. SprecherInnen Leonie Elpelt, Mark Heißler, Cyrena Dunbar. Produziert von Urban Hamlab.